Hi there. Welcome to Unbehaved. My name is Megan French Dunbar, and my guest today is Deepa Purushothaman, author of The First, the Few, the Only, and founder of The Rewrite. I met Deepa nearly a decade ago at a forum of about maybe 30 business leaders who'd gathered for a few days to discuss what it would take to repair business as usual. And I was blown away by her. She was so accomplished and put together. At that time, she was a partner at Deloitte, where she'd been for more than 20 years, and I was girl crushing on her hard. And as we got to know each other a bit over those days, I sensed that maybe, despite the fancy title and all these external measures of success, she didn't seem like she was thriving or maybe even happy. I wasn't wrong. Deepa was barely holding it together behind the scenes. She'd been driving herself so hard for so long, living out of a suitcase 3 cities a week, and it had been catching up to her. She'd been getting sick, like really sick, sometimes slowly losing feeling in her arms and her legs. It took 14 doctors before one of them finally asked her, "Is your job killing you?" What she's done with that question is the whole premise of this episode. We get into what it actually looks like to walk away from the path you're on and build something new, how her definition of success has evolved, including a painfully awkward dinner conversation with her husband on their 9th anniversary, and how to start rewriting your definition of success in alignment with what you actually want. If you've been chasing a definition of success that somebody else handed to you a long time ago, this one's for you. Here's Deepa. Oh, my friend Deepa, who we met, I think, in like a back of a van in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And it has been like 8 or 9 years now. And it is such a pleasure to know you. So you can look at you all over the interwebs. You are quite a prolific human. And you have an incredible story of being kind of at the top of your career, specifically at Deloitte. You're a partner, and I would call it having an awakening around a toxic definition of success. So I'm curious for you, as you are recovering from your toxic definition of success, what has that actually looked like?
Yeah, the long story short is I was at the firm. I was at Deloitte for 21 years, and about 17 years in, I started to get sick, right? And it started as small things, headaches, stomach pains, small things like skin rashes. And then over the course of like 2 years, it grew significantly to the point that I literally was sick every 2 weeks. I couldn't feel from my knees down and my elbows down. And I ended up spending 8 months in bed. And so I took a leave of absence, got really serious. And I traveled, I should say that. So it wasn't just like the stress of the job. I lived out of a suitcase. So a lot of the time I was doing 3 cities a week. And so I was living out of a suitcase. And so I think it was a lifestyle more than anything when you are on the go like that, when you're not sleeping in your bed, when you're not eating properly, when you are just running, right? Like just the things normal people do to take care of themselves, I wasn't doing because they just for so long had not been part of my life. And so when I say toxic success, I think part of it was I wasn't taking care of myself. I wasn't really thinking about the me part of the equation, right? I was looking at what was happening, the results. And that's really a lot of how I was raised, right? I'm the daughter of immigrants. And in our family, there was always a focus on productivity, always a focus on doing more. I grew up with messages about what my parents sacrificed, right, to come here and to stay here. And so that was always a message. And I'm the oldest of 2 daughters. So I have a little bit of that first daughter, all the things that and so there was a lot of that. And so for me, I think there was just such a focus on success is tied to productivity and doing more. You take care of yourself later. When you get older, when you get, always the next thing. Like in school, it was like when you graduate, when you get married, when you like get to the next stage, it was always like that next thing. And then you'll have your happiness and, joy and, take care of yourself. And those things just didn't come at that in the way that I was living. And so for me, a lot of that rewriting has come down to like, what do I want my day to look like? And to be really fair, it wasn't that I had this awakening and it was like, I want to live my life in a better way. It was like, I was not listening to the universe. I love Oprah's, right? Like you get hit with, I'm totally going to mutilate what she says, but it's like a pebble, then a rock, and then, stone, a boulder, and I wasn't listening to all of those, smaller messages. And so I think the sickness, the illness, the years that it took me to get healthy was really sort of that wake up sign, and that you need to stop. Like this way of living isn't working. And to be really clear, Megan, like, and yes, this is like told on the internet because I've told this story so many times. It came from my doctor, like Heather was the 14th doctor and she said to me, right, your job is killing you. What would you do if you didn't do a job like this? Do you feel like you have to do a big job like this to be worthy? And don't you just see you're worthy being you? And I think for a lot of us, we should pause there, right? And let that land for people. Don't you see you're worthy being you? I wasn't. Like my worthiness was tied to my accolades, how much I accomplished, like what I was doing. And I think, I left her office in tears because that question about like worthiness and you was so overwhelming. I hadn't really thought about it that way or let myself think about it that way. I mean, I knew it was kind of lingering, in the back of my head, but I hadn't let myself think about it because it was just too big, like too big to unpack. And so I think a lot of the last couple of years is what kind of life do I want? What do I want my to look like? How do I want to feel? Which are big questions and scary questions when you are used to like, time to think, right? I left my house at
Mhm.
5 o'clock in the morning on Mondays, and sometimes I got back by Friday afternoon. So there was not time to think about what my day looked like. And, even if there was like milk in the refrigerator, that was a big thing for me when I'd come home on Fridays, right there in the refrigerator, even to make a cup of tea. But yeah, so I think it was like unpacking all of that and figuring out like, where does worthiness come from? What does that mean for me? And what if I don't have my job to lean back on? Like, who am I? What do I want to be known as? And those are not easy questions. And part of getting sick also took me on a path of meeting a lot of, spiritual leaders, healers, like people who I would say are not in the traditional corporate path. And so I just was for years having all these really interesting conversations around what does like one's life mean? Like what is happiness? What is worthiness? What does it mean to take care of yourself? And so I think all of those things came together in a really profound way for me.
Is the boulder required? Like, you
Yeah.
can hear it so many times over and over and over again around, like, you're addicted to achievement and you're worthy just as you are. But is a crisis necessary to get people off of the hamster wheel? Or have you seen any ways to actually encourage people to do it before they get just completely laid out and are forced to stop?
Yeah, I literally do stage talks on this topic, like, "Don't wait till you break," is like literally the topic, the title. I think when you are in high performing cultures, no, you often wait till you break. And for a lot of the women that I work with who are highly ambitious, highly accomplished, they have to have a shoe drop. So it's either a health issue, it's a divorce that they didn't see coming, it is not getting a promotion that they were promised and they went over and above and beyond, or it's like the death of a family member, like a parent or someone that they had said they would visit and they just didn't get to, that sort of like, shame and juxtaposition of that. So it's usually one of those four things. And I would say that's true in 90% of the women. I call them corporate heroines, like these women who are rising and with kind of, at some point they have the awakening. They have the sort of, they've gone through the graph or the trek and then they just, hit the wall. And I think it comes from this idea they just haven't given themselves this chance to stop and ask. And I also think for a lot of us, we're chasing success to feel worthy. So we're not even able to ask that question because we're thinking if I fill my cup enough, then I'll be okay. And you and I have talked about this. I find this with so many authors in particular. Like, right, they'll finish their book, the book will go out, and then it's like, is this it? Because I just spent 2 years of my life and there's like this quiet, and so, but I think that happens to everyone. I just think for a lot of the authors I work with, it's just more clear because you've been in this hunkered down by yourself for 2 years, right? And then you come out of it and it's like, that's it. What happens now? What's next? And yeah, it's a very scary process. So I don't think most people figure it out unless they go through some sort of spiritual awakening or realignment because we're taught those lessons. I studied a lot of fairy tales. We're taught those lessons even as little girls, especially how to be, what to want, how to be good, how to be cared for. And so I think unless you rewrite those messages, which most of us won't do, unless there is that reckoning point or that fall or that precipice where you literally just fall over, it doesn't happen.
The question of worth
Mm.
in the absence of success or accomplishment or achievement. Have you gotten to a place now where you are like full on, I regularly feel worthy just as I
Yeah.
am? And what has helped you to do so?
Yeah, I would say yes, but I would say it's not 100% of the time. Like there's still doubts. And, we were on a call like week ago and we, talked about this. Like I'm in a good place, but it doesn't mean that there's not moments, right, where that doesn't creep up on you. I think for me, I started to really think about it because 2 years ago, my husband and I, Manoj, we were out to dinner. I've told the story a few times, but not that many times. We were out to dinner. It was our ninth wedding anniversary. I'm sitting across from him and I just say like, what's, surprised you most about our marriage? Like, surprised you most or like, what's, changed or, the basic questions. And he got really quiet. And all he said was, "You used to be really ambitious. And now you just don't seem as ambitious to me. You were the most ambitious person I'd ever met." And there's a long story to that because we both were partners at Deloitte. We were in each other's circle. We knew of each other before we actually met each other. And I just got quiet the rest of the dinner, like just total, like inner, like, what does that mean? Especially as someone who's so focused on success and accomplishment, like that was a damning,
Yeah.
pronouncement of some type that I couldn't even like find words for. And he knew he had stepped in something because I literally did not say a word at all.
Happy anniversary.
Yeah, and I sat in that for months, like, not sure why I felt all the things I did. I felt a lot of shame about it, to be honest with you, and I realized, and now I can say to him, and I've said to him, he doesn't get it because I just think we're in different places on our journey around this topic, but, my definition of ambition has changed. My definition of ambition is not saying yes to everything. It's not being so harried that I'm, and again, I have moments, like during the book launch, I told you I said yes to everything because I thought I had to. But I'm in a moment where no, like I actually think being ambitious is guarding your energy, is saying yes to the things that you feel like saying yes to. I think it's from that redefinition of what success is, from that redefinition of boundaries, from that redefinition of what I say yes to. I think, yeah, I've gotten to a place where I am very clear. And there was a moment probably a year and a half ago, it was like at the beginning of the year, where I just sat there and I was like, if nothing else happens, like not literally nothing else happens in my career, I'll be okay. I've had enough, done enough. And I don't think I would have been able to say that 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. So yeah, it's a long journey, but it doesn't mean there's not moments where it's quiet and you're like, is that really what's about to happen? Because this has also just been a really hard year for the work that, you and I do. It's just been really different than it's been for me for the last 5 years. And so, yes, I think that reckoning comes up quite a bit right now.
I think it was Rutgers Business School. You did a piece on this, how they looked at the concept of power. And
Mhm.
with men, it manifested as control, kind of like
Mhm.
power over. And with women, it manifested their concept of power was freedom and autonomy and
Yeah.
building power with. And I'm curious about the tie in with the idea of freedom for you with ambition
Yeah.
and how those two things come together and inform like the overall concept of success that you're looking at now.
Yeah. I mean, I think for a lot of us, we have been inherited like this definition of success, this definition of freedom, this definition of ambition that is not really ours, and we don't have alternatives. And so part of what we do is just latch onto this definition that we get from other people. I think for a lot of us and a lot of women, especially in midlife, I think that's the reckoning we're seeing now, like on Instagram and other places, realizing that doesn't really work for us. And there isn't a definition that was made for us. We just kind of assumed that, the 50-year-old definition of ambition applies. And I think we're in this moment where like we don't have the new definition yet, but I think that's really what it is. And so yes, I think like that's part of it is it just didn't fit anymore. I think we'll get there with a new definition or we'll see that there's so many different definitions and it's not just one or two. But I think in corporate spaces or in these high performing spaces, it's often just that one definition. So when you leave that behind, it's hard to know what to replace it with. I answered your question, but yeah. Yeah.
Do you have moments where the kind of the gravity of the old definition of success pulls you back in? And if so, how do you reground and keep returning back to the new practice?
Think so I have this lingering illness, right? So I had late stage Lyme disease, and it definitely flares at times. And so I feel like my body knows better than my mind. So my body will just decide it's going to get sick if I say yes to too many things. I think sometimes I look around and I have FOMO, right? And that's when I start to pay attention to like, is that real or is that just because I'm not doing all the things? And so, yes, it does creep up in those ways. I think my issue is more, I still sometimes say yes to too many things that I don't really enjoy doing and I don't ask enough questions. I say no to more things than I ever did. And I say probably no to more things than I say yes to, but still, sometimes it's still too many things. And there's seasons, right, where it just gets super busy. And so I've just gotten better about criteria about what I say yes to and trying to honor that and also listening because sometimes when I say yes, I will have regrets afterwards. And I'm not one that likes to back down back away when I've said yes to something, but I'll start to pay attention to that and maybe even journal about that so I know next time not to do that.
Mm.
So it's interesting. Yeah, it's a process.
Yeah. Are there any beliefs or practices or norms from the old playbook that you are surprised at how long they held on to or that you still struggle with? Or you were like, wow, I thought I was going to be able to release that pretty easily, and it still
Yeah.
creeps up from time to time.
I think the schedule, like having my days scheduled, like feeling like, if I'm done at 3 o'clock and there's no other meetings, I'm allowed to, go take a walk. Or, Manoj and I always talked because we could never go to dinner like on a Tuesday afternoon. Like for a
Mhm.
long time, I mean, by the way, he traveled too. So we would now not be in the same city, for the first couple of years that we were together. And so that's just odd to us to be able to go to dinner on a Tuesday. And so it's those moments where it feels strange and I have to rewrite that or like pay attention. I think the other thing is just when I don't feel like I'm super busy, when I don't I don't have my checklist going. So I catch myself sometimes in those moments.
You mentioned something in the previous answer that I want to get back to. The difference between being in a season of busyness and being kind of in a
Yeah.
system of busyness. And
Yeah.
I have a lot of people that I know that I feel like they've been in a season of busyness for a decade. And
Yeah.
I'm still like, a season requires it to have a beginning and end, and there is no end. So how do people recognize and get themselves out of I am actually in a season versus this season has become my entire life?
I think most of the people that come to me are in the system of busyness. I love that phrasing, right? They're just, and they don't even see it, right? And part of, I think, the work that you and I do is pointing out the deficiencies in the system because until a few years ago, we didn't even talk about that. Like, I do think that that's new language, new vocabulary. And this is not my work, but I've seen it spoken of enough that I don't think you can necessarily attribute to one person. But I have come to believe that, thinking of it almost like a harvest, that there are seasons where you are planting, there are seasons where you are reaping. And to think about it that way has really given me some freedom because there are parts like right now, for example, like I'm redoing a lot of my website. I'm redoing a lot of like my speaking topics. The things I used to talk about are not necessarily things people want to hear now, just as a concrete example. That's a lot of like busy work. Like there's not necessarily an immediate reward to that, but it has to get done. And it's tedious work, right? Like it's taken me like a month and that's all I've been doing. It feels like full time for like a month. But I also know come the fall that will pay dividends, right? Like, and if I don't do it now, I'm not going to be able to reap that later. So, kind of thinking about it in that way, really thinking about those sorts of analogies, I think has really helped me and given me some freedom to realize that it's okay to have, the fallow periods. It's okay to rotate even what you're doing and what you're talking about. Um, and really thinking about it in those ways that's given me some flexibility.
Yeah. I read the book Wintering
Uh-huh.
when I resigned from my first company.
Mhm.
I mean, because between COVID and babies and all
Yeah.
the things, I ended up like having a fallow period of about 2 years.
Yeah.
And I was wrestling in that with my sense of self and worth and all the things, but I was also just recovering.
Yeah.
It was just an insane time. And the concept of seasonality based on our actual seasons, I was like, how has this never occurred to me that we do in
Yeah.
fact need to like sit fallow for a bit? Otherwise we can't continually produce.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of there's a lot of also writing on just kind of how women especially need that, right? Or we should really think about um, the moon cycles, right? And just there's all these different things out there. If you start to get a little bit, you talk about woo-woo-ness, but how far you're willing to go, what you're willing to read, there's a lot of different ways that people work, and I think that's part of the rewriting, right? We have most of us been taught this very specific capitalist way of working, and I think there are different ways of working that are just as rewarding. I mean, I started to look at a lot of artists and writers, and I think, growing up, there wasn't a lot of space in my world, or I didn't necessarily understand the process of creation in that way, right? Like creative energy is a very different process. And I might have maybe looked down on it a little bit, I think, as I was growing up, because it wasn't part of what was encouraged in our family, and so those quiet periods are like, I'm thinking about what I'm going to write or thinking about what I'm going to do. Like that wasn't, encouraged. And so now I can see like that's part, like you can't just keep creating, you can't just keep writing because the words don't land in the same way, but taking breaks and coming back to it, taking a walk to come back to it, it changes. And so yeah, I think there's even just an appreciation for the different ways that people work and understanding that. And why can't we bring more of those worlds together is, I think, part of the work that you and I do in small ways.
The women that you're working with
Mhm.
regularly, are there kind of constant or regular themes that you're seeing, and especially around consistent harmful beliefs or anything that's surprising you that you're like, well, like I had a narrative about how they were all going to do X, but
Yeah.
instead they're actually totally different.
Unfortunately, no. I feel like, coming out of COVID, it felt like we were switching and like there was an awakening, people were changing. And there was almost I ran a women's organization or a community for a couple of years after COVID. And so there was a really intense interest in doing that work around COVID. Then it felt like a lot of the women that were coming to me were like, I'm done with that. I'm back in my job full time. Like, I don't have the time for it. Like, everything's good. Everything's better. Right. And I have a lot of women reaching out to me just in the last month or two, like they are feeling broken again in a very different way, like in a very deep sort of way, and asking if, where they can go for community, where they can go for the conversation again. So I do feel like we're back to that, a little bit of that COVID energetic time for women, especially that, I've been everywhere and done everything that's still not working. I also think we're starting to see the system cracks, right? Like the numbers just in the last week or two, there's been new job numbers, there's been new leadership numbers because we're, in Women's History Month in some places, I want to say, quote.
Right?
But there's just a lot of like new data about women advancing and all the numbers for the first time in ever, it feels like, in the last 20, 30 years, they're actually regressing. So I think a lot of women are feeling like if they are in these traditional jobs, especially again, a lot of the women that come to me are more corporate or, lead large organizations such as who's attracted to kind of the work that I do in my own background. I think they're realizing in a way that it felt like the system we talked about, it got better. It was, we figured some things out. I think they're now seeing the numbers dwindle again. So there's this sense of overwhelm, like not only in themselves, but just like it's really broken and it didn't get any better. And it's almost worse now because there's a denial that, after kind of taking the lid off of it the last couple of years. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is I feel a genuine sense of hopelessness, of anxiety. I think we'll get past it. I think we'll come back to like, what are we going to do about it now? But in this moment, it feels like we're in the anxiety overwhelm part of the cycle until we organize and figure out what are we doing about it.
Yeah, it's bringing up another question for me. So for context, Deepa and I we're an authors group together with some other extraordinary humans, and we have kind of every 6 weeks or so we have a call, and one of the things that came up on our last call was really around freedom and around our work, and a lot of us having opportunities to potentially go in-house somewhere or be, hired for certain roles, and all of us saying like, nah, for now at least, being an entrepreneur and running my own thing is the thing that I need for right now. And for me personally, my experience of that is in order to fully live into my newer definition of success, which really is built around what do I want my days to look like? What do I want to feel like? Mental health, physical health, my connection with my kids and my family, my friends. It's really like, here is my life and how does my work fit into that? Not basing everything around my work. That for me so far has at least required me to run my own
Um,
company and be
yeah,
my own entrepreneur and have the financial stress. Like the flip side of it is the
yeah,
financial stress of eat what you kill. And we're out here figuring out how to make revenue,
yeah.
which is stressful. But for me, the trade-off, I'm like, yeah, there's not even a question for me that I would go somewhere. So I'm curious for you, and this doesn't necessarily have to be an absolute, but is running your own company or like breaking out to do your own thing necessary to live a really like new and profound definition of success? Or have you seen it done with someone working for a high pressure organization?
I have, and I think if I was to go
Yes.
back, I would do it differently, but it's rare. And what it requires is knowing who you are, knowing what your boundaries are in a very sort of clear way, and I'll unpack that in a minute. And also knowing where you conform and knowing where you won't. And that's a little bit of boundaries, but in a very different way. And I think part of what you're describing is for a lot of the women, again, that we both know, there's a force fitting that happens when you are in these high performing structures. And a lot of it has to do with how they were built, right? They were built decades ago, right? Based on centuries ago of capitalism. But this idea of a two-parent household where one person went out to work and one person was always home, usually the woman. And that model, that ideal worker model doesn't work today. It's never been updated. So this idea of freedom, like most women I know don't feel free because when they're at work, they're worried about, their kids home. When they're at home, they're worried about like not doing all the things at work. And so The men I talk to, I'm not saying they don't have it, but they don't have it to the extent that I see it with the women that I work with. And so I do think that it comes from that, how we define an ideal worker and the expectations around that work. So yeah, it's very hard to find that freedom, but it can happen if you go into these systems knowing it may cost me, but I'm going to be true to who I am. Or I'm going to push back on the things that don't feel right. Or I'm going to be in full voice as I navigate these places, which a lot of women don't do. You asked me before, like, what do you see a lot of women do? What do they struggle with? A lot of them believe they have to be grateful for the opportunities they're given. So they don't speak up. They don't push back. They work 2 and 4 times as hard as others around them because they feel like they have to, right? Because they're walking that tightrope. And so part of what you have to become is really clear who you are. And the women who are really clear are able to set those boundaries, are able to be themselves in those situations and know it may cost them, but they'll be okay. They actually do better than everybody else because they're so clear and they're so, back to your question around what's powerful, they're so powerful. But it's not just authentic power. I don't love that label. It's just clarity of like, no, not going to do that. It may cost me, but that's okay. And there's such gravitas in that we don't talk about enough. And it just kind of 2 things on added to that. One is that when I work with women, what I find is it's not like 100 things that define those boundaries that really are their identity, that give them that power. It's usually like 6 to 8 things. But most of us haven't sat down to figure out what are those 6 or 8 things for us. And once you know those 6 or 8 things, then I tell women, well, don't give on those things at work, right? Like that's super important. Like if you start to give on those things, you're not going to feel great. You're not going to feel like you have freedom. You're not going to feel powerful. And that's really, that's a lot of where my work comes from. Too many women I was meeting when I was doing dinners prior to leaving and before writing the book, they were just sitting in these rooms saying, I don't feel powerful. And they were like very senior women, right? And if they don't feel powerful, what hope do the rest of us have? So I think it's a real sort of concern, a real thing.
Are there any specific examples that you can provide of those like 6 to 8 of either someone else's or yours where it's really clear what it
Yeah, I
is
think
that
for
they
some
found?
women, it's like I have a chronic illness, right? So people need to know that because I'm not, if I have I work with some women, it's like migraines or heart issues, right? Like if they're having a really stressful day, they need to set that boundary. But if they don't let people around them know that that's a concern, then they'll be in this constant, should I go to that meeting? Should I answer that email right now? Like, so it's this they know what they need to do, but they're not honoring themselves or they're not able to set that boundary. And so it's like, that's an example. To be at my kids' soccer game, I'm their soccer coach. And that's really an important part of my identity. I spend hours a week doing this. Once they tell their teammates that, their teammates are the ones that are pushing them out the door because they know they'll get back online or they'll answer, after those 2 hours. It's not like 10 hours, it's 2 hours, but they haven't necessarily told people around them. So they don't get the support that they need. They don't necessarily get the recognition around that. So it's those kinds of things, right? Or I'm from another country. And so this other part, it's a lot of identity things, right? Like this other part of who I am is really important. I don't want to hide it anymore. So those parts are more around authenticity, but it's a little bit of just the things that are who you are outside of your workplace that you need some help on so that you can honor those things and not feel like you're, pushing them aside or in constant pressure from that ideal worker sort of idea, right? That I have to let all of those things go because in the workplace, I'm only that ideal worker and I don't have any needs or wants or life outside of the desk that I'm chained to.
The concept of authenticity. There's this conflation of authenticity meaning like just show up as yourself. I always like imagine someone being like, I can just dye my hair whatever I want and say whatever I want.
I always say wear
And
flip-flops just for work. That's kind of the one I give, right? Like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So just digging in a little bit around the nuance, what does authentic power or authentic leadership
Yeah.
really look like? And how do people know when they're tiptoeing the line between what is, quote, professional, like their professionalism, and assimilation? That feels like a hard line to toe sometimes.
I think only you can know. Again, that's kind of that work of those 8 to 10 things. For some women, it's right, I'm not going to change my hair or I'm going to dress, in this very unique, specific way. And I am going to do that because that's important to my identity. So I think it's understanding, again, what your own list is. But I think it's also understanding the context you're in because not every company culture or every organizational culture is the same. So what are some of the things that are not important in your company culture? Maybe email etiquette is, right? But what your footwear is doesn't really need to understand both. And then you need to decide. It's an active choice on if you're going to push on that or not push on that, right? If that's not an okay boundary that they've set for you, because it really does feel like it's something that takes your power away or takes your freedom away. And I think in some cases, you have to dip your toe in and do it wrong, and then you get kind of the feedback. and then you kind of figure it out. But I think for a lot of us, I say in the book, like, I was surprised how many young women, and this just came up for whatever reason as I was having this conversation with people. It was like this red lipstick item. Like there were a number of young women that I interviewed, and they were like, "I love to wear red lipstick, and I don't know if I'll be taken seriously if I can wear it." It's just this small example of like this, but that became like at least 10 or 12 women said that to me. Like red lipstick seems to be like a not going to be taken seriously in the workplace, and I had never thought about that or heard of that, or I wore red lipstick whenever I wanted to. Like it never occurred to me. So I just think like it can be a small thing, but you just have to kind of gauge in your workplace. Like, is that important to you? Is that part of your identity? And then like in your workplace, I think that's really going to push people. And it doesn't mean don't do it, but it just, it means figure out how do you do it in a way that you take people along the journey with you, maybe.
From our initial book interview I did with you, which I think is almost 2.5 years ago, even at the height of your old playbook, toxic definition of success, you're working up to be a partner at Deloitte, there was still this part of you that didn't assimilate fully into what, quote, you should do. Two of them being, one, your ability when a partner would give you work, if you didn't fully understand it, to be like, I don't know, can you help? And there was one story I believe you told of when you were thinking about becoming a partner, hearing from other women specifically who had made partner that you were going to need to learn how to play golf. And you were just like, yeah, hard no, I'm just not going to do that. So even at your busiest, when you were a corporate Olympian, as you often say, you still had this presence of mind to like not fully drink all the Kool-Aid. What do you attribute that to? The ability to still say no, even in the highest pressure environments when you are really in it?
I think it comes from not ever feeling like I belonged, right? Growing up in places where I just felt so different. My dad, wanted, I think, two boys, and he ended up with two girls. And I, come from an Indian culture where he would often say to us when we were little, like, if I had a boy, right? And if I had a boy, became, well, I'll go show you. So there was always this like, I'll show you. And then at Deloitte, to be super clear, like I was the only non-MBA in my 700-person start class. So I came in not feeling like I knew anything. And so I would ask questions from the start. Single when I made partner, and I was in my early 30s. And so a lot of the partners around me, the models, they did have a partner, and a partner who was able to spend, for most part, significant amount of time at home. So I had this different set of issues of how I was going to make my life work. And I talked about it a lot because I didn't feel like I belonged. So to answer your question, I think I started from I'm totally different. Like I'm a orange in a sea of apples and just never even tried to fit in those sorts of ways. And so fitting in might have been the odd thing to do as opposed to like being different, just because I was so, and I think it came from the background, the training more than anything, not so much, and the age, not so much gender or race. It was just more that I was younger than everybody and I was such a different skill set.
I feel like when you're talking about kind of like the bell curve of adoption, you're someone I feel like is always a bit ahead of things. You're a bit of a future trend spotter and issue spotter. The First, the Few, the Only came out at a really relevant time, which for it to come out at a really relevant time means that you've been working on it for a few years. So what are you thinking about now? Or what are the things, the conversations and questions, where's your curiosity leading you right now that might be a little bit ahead of its time?
It's a great question. I think it's a lot of the things we covered, right? I mean, I think the last couple of years I was writing a lot about toxic workplaces, right? So that I felt very on the front end of that. And by the way, I've had a number of people describe me in that way. So it's interesting. I always find it fascinating because I don't see myself that way. So I think like that was probably the last couple of years. And I want to come back to that because you said something before that, it's made me think of something. I think then the last year or so, I've been really thinking for women, like just what's happening, because it just feels like it's a particularly difficult time for women. And on top of it, we have all of this sort of trad wife versus feminist. If you post anything about it, I've never experienced anything like this on social media, like the comments, the feedback, it's fascinating. So I think like that's probably the moment that we're in right now. I think what's coming next, and I was doing some work on martyrs, modern martyrs, and just what it means to like really look at all the stories that we've inherited as women about how we should be, what success should look like. And I think the thing I'm sitting in a little bit now is really around success and ambition. They're very much tied to being the same thing. But I think we're in this moment, we're coming out of this. A lot of us are going to start to look at success and ambition in very different ways and start to think about it and define it for ourselves versus the the way that it's been defined and given to us. So I think that's probably where I see a lot of the work going. I also think we're in this moment of great uncertainty and all the rest of it in a way that we've never seen before. It's like when I say that, people are like, well, it's always been uncertain, but it feels extra layered. So I think that that's also part of just how do we navigate this time and where are we going to end up coming out of this? And just what matters to us? How do we start to work differently? Like the things that you and I talk about, just our workplace cultures are completely changing as a result of the moment that we're in and also just AI and everything else that's coming. So, like, what is truly important for the ways we work feels like something of where I'm headed.
Is there a question or set of questions that you recommend to people to like help them begin
Mm.
thinking about a new definition of success?
Yeah, I think it's like just, very simply starting with a list of like, what about your life gives you angst right now, right? Well, like for me, it was travel. I remember when I was a new partner, I made a list of the kind of partner I wanted to be, and I still have that list, right? And it was kind of it wasn't a long list. It was like 15 things, which is why I can say, like, for most people, it's not like it's a long list. Um, and yet it also had like small things. Like, one of the big things was I'd worked with someone who constantly did Saturday morning calls. And I just remember writing like number 7 on my list was like, I'm never going to do a Saturday morning call. And I became a partner that never did a Saturday morning call. So I think it's a little bit of like, what do you, the aspiration, but also a little bit of the what you never want to do. So you need both lists, like the negatives of what you don't enjoy, like you really despise about your work week or the life that you've kind of set up in the routine you're in. And then I do think it's a little bit of like, what do you wish you had? And it's just journaling. Like, what do you want your day to look like? What do you want your week to look like? What do you want your month to look like? And just journaling and just seeing the patterns that come out of that. So much of what I do now is just looking at patterns, right? It's just what is coming up for people because so many of us think it's just me, but those patterns are pretty consistent, and especially for the women that I work with. So for a lot of them, it's about having flexibility at work, which is like the thing that feels like it's under attack in this moment.
Mhm.
It is like being able to turn off at certain points, right? To be able to have like shutdown time. It's also related to travel and hours. It's just kind of that's a lot of what freedom looks like, right? Just being able to manage that and to make your life work, make your life work with your work, versus working your life around your work.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wish that I had asked you about?
No, but I wanted to come back to the toxic thing because I think you mentioned,
Yes.
like, for yourself, you were saying it took you a while, that fallow period. I just want to acknowledge, because I think a lot of people are probably listening, right, are going through periods of that fallow. It usually takes 2 years, is what the research shows, to come out of a situation, right? If you're pivoting, if you've been in a toxic situation, if you're starting over, if you're changing your career. I think for a lot of us, we look at someone who's left and, like people look at me because I did sell my book like 6 weeks after I left and like my whole, life took off in a very fast way. But there was a lot of stuff you don't see behind the scenes. So I think for most people, just understanding that it takes a couple of years to start over, to recover, to re-regulate your nervous system from like the machine and the system and all the things that you were mentioning, like those are all part of it. And we need to factor that in. It's not just that you make your list and you go to your next thing. Like there's a process to unplug. And it's a slow process to really pivot your life in the ways that we're describing. And these are big, big ways. Like I would say of the thousands of women I work with, less than 100 pivot in like very big, because it's scary, and you get a lot of questions. So it's rare. So I would just kind of give yourself the grace to leave where you are, to figure out what you want next, and to also realize that it's hard to make the list of what you want your life to look like when you're still in your old life. And if
Mm.
you can afford it, if you can take that fallow period that you're describing and just be quiet and just see who emerges, the life that you create 2 years later will be completely different than what you would have penned when you were in the chaos or in the discomfort or in the questions about success and ambition. So you almost have to unplug, be quiet, look around, and then reset.
I'm so glad you brought up when you left Deloitte, you sold the book 6 weeks later and all the things. It looks easy and it
Mhm.
looks like it can be done pretty quickly. And the work behind the scenes, at least in my experience, it was incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I felt unmoored and untethered, and I was frustrated and angry, and I felt very lost. I mean, I took full 2 years. And my therapist at the time, she had this word, I think it was interstice. It's like this middle period where on your journey, you've been in this land for a while and you want to get to a healthier land over here, but you have to take the journey in between the like mucky swamp
Yeah.
to get there. And there is no going around it. And if you don't go through that uncomfortable transformational period and give yourself the grace and the patience, nothing will change. You might change your title or you might change your position, but your actual mentality, your mindset, you can't change in a matter of weeks. It's really hard to say that to people
Yeah.
because it almost discourages people from taking the leap. And practically, I literally just like hobbled together some consulting gigs, took some little like side projects here and there, and I like made it work financially for myself. So it is doable and it doesn't take away from the fact that like it's necessary and it's uncomfortable, but
Yeah.
it's completely and totally worth it. Of all the gobbledygook I just spit out, what resonates for you around the like what is necessary for full transformation?
Yeah, I mean, mine was right getting sick and having to figure out like what am I going to do next? How am I going to heal? Right. And I literally was in bed for almost a year before that point. So I think like in order to figure out who you want to be, you almost have to take all the parts of yourself out. That's how I describe it. Like you have to unpack the suitcase and then decide what parts you want to put back in. But most of us don't get the time or give ourselves a grace to unpack the suitcase, right? And that's the part that I got pushed into because I got sick. So yes, it looks like on the outside, it's 6 weeks, but there was a year where I literally physically couldn't get out of bed and couldn't get on calls and couldn't, all I was doing was laying in bed thinking about what is my life. So I do think that's true. I also think it's very much tied to the hero's journey, right? And which is why I study or call it the corporate heroine. There is a process by which like that's written about extensively, like the hero's journey. For the hero to go become the hero, he has to hit like this reckoning and then go figure out, like go on the odyssey and then kind of come back to who he is by learning all the parts he picks up in that odyssey, in that desert that you're describing. That's literally what the hero's journey is. I don't love it because it doesn't really talk about women, right? And women's journey, but that's the idea of it. And so that's what you're describing. And it's been well documented, well researched. Most psychologists will talk about that. So yeah, I think you don't actually um, create a new life unless you're forced to, right? Unless you kind of go through that period of figuring out what makes sense.
As we think about rewriting the heroine's journey, what is the foundational rewrite that you would like to offer or invite people to explore?
I think figuring out what your core, I don't want to call it issue, but your core desire is. And, you talked about that Rutgers paper, like freedom spoke to me. And like part of why I loved that paper and like wanted to be a part of it is because for me, it was freedom. I think you have to figure out what your North Star is. And then once you know, because it's not freedom for everybody. It's not free. It is for a lot of women, but for some, it's just, space or it's quiet or it's, slowing down. And yes, in some ways that's all tied to freedom, but like it's defined in a very different way. So I think it's my advice is figuring out what your North Star is, and I did a lot of work when I was still at Deloitte to realize for me it was alignment, and alignment then eventually became freedom. So you can do that part of the work wherever you are right now and figuring out what is it that drives you and it is important to you and would thrill you. And then once you know that, you can start on the journey and do everything else. But if you don't know what that North Star is, it's really hard.
Ugh, every time I talk to you, my cup feels so much fuller. How do people support you, find you, plug in with you? What is really helpful to you
I
right
do a
now
lot
besides
of
like going out and buying your book?
I do a lot of writing on LinkedIn. So, that's probably the best way to follow me or hear what's going on. Deepa Puru. And then we have the rewrite. So that's definitely somewhere where we post a lot of the research and the things that we're doing. But yeah, I would say LinkedIn is probably the easiest place to go for right now.
Awesome. I'll put that in the show notes. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And just, because I know you've been grappling with a lot of the same conversations, pieces.
Fellow travelers.